Okay, so you want some tips on A-level maths? Well, don't worry. I've got lots of tips. I don't want to waste any of your time, but I've made them categorized into all these different sections. I'm going to talk about what you should do during lessons, and then after lessons, and then before exams, then during exams, and then I'll go into some tips about stats and mechanics, because that's the applied side of maths and people can usually find that quite difficult compared to pure maths. And then I'm going to finish off with a few general tips as well. Stick around till the end because I've got a lot of stuff here. I've got lots of resources dotted across the video as well. So you're in the maths lesson right now. What should you do? Should you be taking notes? Should you be doing the questions? What should you actually do during this time? So what my recommendation is to always be attempting the questions that you're given in class. And I would say it's more important to know how to do those questions than to actually make notes, because a lot of things in maths you're going to realize is quite content based in A-level compared to GCSEs. So you're probably going to find yourself making notes during the lessons and keeping down key information, especially to do with like the mechanics and statistics side, which is important, yes, but I would say it's more important, especially during the lessons, to actually attempt the questions and see if you can actually do them. And if you can't, to actually ask your teacher, make sure you actually know how to do those questions, because once you come home, when you get given homework and things like that, if you don't know how to do the questions in the first place, it can be very difficult trying to learn what to do. And if you spend all the time during the lesson just making notes and not actually listening to how to do the questions, then this can really make it difficult for you after you come home. And this is something that I experienced a lot in year 12, and I have realized that for next year I'm not going to be making the same mistake, because it's really easy to take notes, especially after you've learned the content and you've understood how to do the questions. But making notes during the lessons when you're still unfamiliar with how the questions work can be a bit problematic. So first thing is to focus more on doing the questions rather than making the notes. And as you might have seen in some of my day in the lives, this is something I'm not very good at. I like to mess around quite a bit during maths lessons especially, but if you can do this and actually attempt the questions, you don't need to always do all of them, but especially if you know how to do the question, that's fine. You don't even need to attempt it. The main thing is to know what's going on rather than just blindly making notes. That's my first tip. Okay, so whilst you guys are there, make sure you ask your teachers some questions as well during class, especially if you find yourself doing questions at home that you didn't actually know how to answer. If you bring those questions with you to class and ask your teacher how to do those questions, it can be really, really useful. And this is something that I did, especially towards the end of the year when I started doing more and more revision for my end of years. I found questions I didn't really understand how to do, and rather than spending ages trying to understand them, I just went straight to my teacher during class and was like, how do you do these questions? And then it would make sense. This is your time to ask questions about this topic, because afterwards you're going to move on to another topic and then you're going to be lost, and you don't want things to pile up. Never say, oh okay, I'm just going to go over it at home. Ask your teacher about it right then and there. Trust me, it's going to save you so much time and so much effort, especially when you get to the end of years when you're trying to relearn all that information if you haven't already, and it's just going to be so much information overload if you just left everything all the way till the end. So that's another thing that I recommend. That's tip 2 complete. Let's get to tip 3. Okay, so for this third tip, I want to go back to what I was saying about doing questions in class, and it's really important to not only do those questions, but to actually make note of how to do those questions. So for example, if you have like a notebook or something, so for me I did on my iPad, I would during the class make example questions on every part of the topic, and so that meant that if I ever came back to that topic and I didn't understand how to do those questions, I can just look at the example questions and it would be like a work solution underneath where I would show the step-by-step process and how to do it, and then I'd just instantly learn how to do that question again. I think for me, my main issue with maths is that I constantly forget topics, and it's really easy to just forget how to do a question. So if I have like example 1, example 2, example 3 for every topic, then it's so much easier to just come back to it and just understand how to do it. So let me just show you a few of the examples I've done in my iPad on my good notes. I don't want to spend too long on this, but I'll just give you guys a few examples. Okay, so for example, here are my binomial expansion notes. I have got a bit of information about what Pascal's triangle is and like all that stuff, right? But then the important part is my example 1, my example 2, and that's it, I think. Wait, no, I've got some stuff about factorial notation here as well, but the important part about this is the example question. So if I ever forget how to do binomial expansion, I just come back here and I can just see an example question and see exactly the method in how I do this. So this is always how I do it. Not only do I have one example, I have several examples just to really understand the different ways they can ask the same questions. And also, if I didn't really understand one of the example questions, I can look at another one and try and relearn the thing from that one instead. Mainly what I do during the lesson is this stuff over here, and then after the lesson I'd make this stuff up here and make it all look nice and fancy and actually make it make sense with the example questions as well. Okay, so we've learned now that during the lessons the most important thing for you to do is understand how to do the questions, and that should be your #1 priority every maths lesson during A levels. Also, if you have any questions, make sure to ask the teacher, obviously, especially if there's a question that you don't really understand how to do. Make sure you get everything clarified during the lesson, so when you come home it's all much easier to understand. And of course, if you are doing questions, to make note of those questions and use them as example questions. Once you come back to them, it's much easier to understand what is going on because you've got questions to work through rather than just blocks of notes, because maths is a really practical subject. To get good at maths, you just need to get good at doing the questions. So if your notes are based on the questions, then it's much easier to get better at maths. That's everything you should do during the lesson. Let's move on to what you should do right afterwards. Okay, now we need to talk about what you need to do after you come back from school. Now, there's only one tip I have for you guys after school, and that's if you don't have any homework or anything, to just practice as many questions as you can, especially at the very start. Once you've learned a new topic, it's really important to get in as much practice into that topic, so it just really becomes super easy to do questions on that topic. And the more questions you do, especially across the variety of different questions that they can give you on that topic, the better you get at the questions. This is something that's not new. You should know this from GCSE. If you don't know how to do a topic, after you've understood how the concept works and everything, you should just get straight into practice, and the rest of the learning is through the practice, because once you do practice questions, you realize that there's different ways they can ask questions from you that if you hadn't done practice you wouldn't have known about, and that's really your main aim after a lesson. But if you have done most of the stuff during the lesson, you don't even need to do much after a maths lesson usually, apart from perhaps polishing your notes, especially if there's blanks in them. Make sure that everything's up to date. That's why even if you don't get set homework, just doing a few questions after a maths lesson on that topic, or maybe during a free period, can really help, but it's not essential. I think the most important thing is to just make sure you understand the topic and not to leave it and be like, okay, when an exam will come then I'll understand it. Just make sure you're confident with doing all the different types of questions, and if you did most of those questions during class, then you don't need to do much at home. But if you left all those questions, I think it would be better for you to come home and do those questions. That's literally the only tip I have for what you should do after a lesson. So make sure you just practice and practice. I mean, this is something that if you're in A-level, if you're GCSE, it should be the same for GCSE or A-level maths. It's the exact same thing. Just practice as much as you can and you'll be fine. Okay, so now you have an exam. This could be either an end of term assessment or it could be the actual end of years themselves. Whatever type of exam you have, you should have a pretty much similar style of maths revision for them. It should be the same thing really. So firstly, if we go back to our example questions, make sure you go over those and try and understand all the topics again, because by now you probably don't have the best grasp of those topics that you had covered right after the lessons. But now you should be able to go over those example questions and try and relearn the topics like that. But if that doesn't work, or you just don't have example questions, what you can do instead is to find YouTube videos of people doing those questions as like worked examples. You can find loads of these for A-level maths. I personally am not someone who used YouTube as that much for A-level maths, but I have a lot of friends who did. I'm someone who relied more on my own notes and my own example questions, and that helped for me to understand a topic again. But it really depends what you find useful. So for me, it was just making example questions myself and doing them like that, but for other people it might just be looking at YouTube videos where people go over the questions like that. So it's really something that you're going to have to work out yourself, but that's the first thing you should do. Make sure you actually understand how to do those topics again. As I've said already, maths is a very practical subject and you really need to do practice as much as you can in order to do well. Okay, so let's assume you know how to do the topic now. What you need to do is you need to go to like your textbooks, or like, for example, I'll give you some resources that you can use for practice questions. You can use PMT, Maths Genie. There's a really good one called Exam Q as well that I highly recommend. You can search through past papers and find things topic by topic. It's a really good exam database that you can sift through and find specific questions that you want to do. So highly recommend that as well. And what you need to do now, so you should have loads and loads of questions, is to go through those questions and try and see if you can do them. If you know how to do them, just don't attempt the question. There's literally no point in doing a question if you know how to do it, right? At the very start, attempt the questions, make sure you know what you're doing in case you're actually in the exam and you get a question like that, so you don't forget how to do it. But then afterwards, the more and more questions you do, just skip the ones you know how to do, especially for pure maths, where I think the main difficulty is knowing what to do in the first place, but once you've gotten that, the rest is easy. If you can do them, then just skip them, but if you're a bit uncertain, make sure you do them to see if you can actually do it. But if you know you're going to get it right, there's no point wasting time on it. It's a really false sense of confidence if you're just doing questions that you know you're going to get right. If you're getting all your questions right, that could be a good sign, but it could also be a problem. It might mean that you're not actually focusing on the topics that you're weakest at. So if you're getting questions wrong, that's usually a good sign, because you can learn from it, and you're just really trying to find those difficult questions. Because if you stick with things really difficult in your revision, you can come into your exam and it'll be much easier and it'll be much better usually. But I do want to say one thing: just because you're doing difficult questions doesn't mean that you'll know how to do the easier questions as well. So make sure you still practice them and don't skip them because you'll probably do in the exam, for example. Make sure you still regularly do those easier questions every now and again, so you know how to do those as well, because that's a really common thing that happens to people, where you can do the really difficult stuff but somehow you just forget how to do the very basics. So that's important as well. I don't want you guys to forget about the basics as well. Now let's assume you have an exam tomorrow, for example. You just get notified that you have a big exam tomorrow on some random maths topic, wherever it is, right? Let me just say what I'm going to do in that situation. So firstly, I'm going to open up the Edexcel maths textbook, because that's what we use as a score to do practice questions, and that's what we get that homework with and everything. It's a really good textbook, and if you do Edexcel, you probably have access to it as well. But the part that I find really useful in them, if you have the textbook as well, I highly recommend for you to check it out if you haven't already, is the mixed exercise sections for every topic, because those just give the all the different ways that questions can be worded all in one place. And if you can do all of those, you're most likely going to be able to do any questions on that topic. But if you find a type of question in that mixed exercise list that you're struggling with, then you can go to the subtopic that that question came from and then do more practice on that. This is also one really specific piece of advice as well. On the day of your exam, especially if it's a big exam, I want you to go over all the different types of subtopics there are and just make sure you know how to do all of them. Because for me, my main error with maths is the fact that I just forget how to do those basic things. So just always skim through questions and make sure you know how to do them. That's why it's so important to skip through questions that you know how to do, so you can quickly find the questions that you might have forgotten how to do, even if they're really basic things, because each topic has their own really small things that you just need to know how to do. And if you forget how to do them, you can easily lose out on marks on the I don't know what just happened there, but you can easily lose marks on those small things. So make sure you go over everything regularly, just to give yourself some peace of mind. Okay, so I'm in an exam now. What do I do? The first thing that I think is the most important for maths is time management. You really need to be able to manage your time, and you should know if you're someone that's good at managing time for maths or not. I think it really depends on the person. If you find that when you're doing exams and stuff you constantly run out of time, that is something that you're going to have to really make a focus on, because time pressure can really hinder your progress during a maths test. So what I recommend for you to do, especially if you struggle with time management, is to, once you begin a maths test, to flick through the questions and to start with the questions that you know how to do, and to do those ones first. Don't waste your time on the ones that you think you might know how to do, but they've got a few weird things, so you're going to have to think about it a bit. Start with the easier questions, do the ones that you just know you're going to get all the marks for, get them out of the way, because you can get them out of the way very quickly, and then you have more time for the longer questions that might take a bit more of your time. Don't sit there ever and not do anything. If you're staring at a question and you just don't know where to start, don't do that question, move on from it, because when you come back to it you can hopefully look at it from a different perspective and find a way to begin. I think the most important thing to really test is when you're going to a question, to see if you can do it. Try and think of all the steps in your head first and then start the question. If you can't think of every single step, then just don't do that question yet, come back to it afterwards. Really focus on the easier questions that you know how to do, because sometimes those can be worth a lot of marks. So if it is, then really secure those marks and then just move on to some of the other questions. You don't need to waste time on 1 mark questions that you just forgot how to do it, so you just need to sit there for about 3 or 4 minutes to really remember how to do them. You just don't need to waste that time, especially if you're someone who struggles with time management. This is not a good idea at all. So I highly recommend for you to stick with the questions you know how to do first, and then you can start wasting your time on the ones you don't know how to do. But not really wasting your time, because you know that you don't have any more time for the other ones anyways, because you've done all of them, so you're technically still using that time effectively. Now if you're someone who usually finishes the test quite early, or you just happen to finish the test early enough, what I recommend to do, and this is something I recommend in GCSE time as well, is that once you've done the test and you've actually attempted all the questions, to come back to the very first question again and to just reattempt the entire question again, but try and do it in a different approach. So you're doing a different method, but hopefully you can get the same answer. And this really just completely takes out the aspect of silly mistakes. So if you have the time, don't waste that time sitting around and just briefly going over each question, being yeah, okay, that looks right. Just actually attempt the question again. Block your answer from previously and just reattempt that entire question question and try and do it in a different way and see if you get the same answer. This has saved me so many marks in the past, especially my end of years. I remember doing this method. I started from the very beginning, and the first question in our test was a straight line graphs question. It was a really easy question. It was literally calculating the gradient of a line, and I had messed it up. And when I did the question again, I realized I got a different gradient, and then I was like, wait a minute, I did the maths wrong. And then that mark came into the next couple of questions as well. And I know I would have probably gotten carried on marks, but just because of that, I think I saved myself loads of marks. So it's really important for you guys to do this, especially if you have the free time to do so. Make sure that once you've done the exam to just start reattempting the questions. I usually like just getting a pencil out and then doing the whole question in pencil, but it really depends, it's up to you. But it's a really effective technique in my opinion. If you have the time to do so, you should really do it. Okay, so those are the tips depending on time and like when to do certain things. Now I'm going to go over a few tips on the applied math section, so the statistics and the mechanics, because this is something that I personally have had a lot of problems with this year. And it's just, if you're not in year 12 yet and you want some like insight on what stats and mechanics is, it's basically, it's not like the pure maths that you're used to in GCSE. So stats is more graph based and more collecting data based and stuff like that, whereas mechanics is literally just physics, and like it's really different to what you'd normally expect. So let me start off with like some general tips about stats and mechanics. So my general advice for both of them is that there are always some marks that you can collect at the very end of every question, and they're questions that are like very repeatable. They appear every single time in some way or another. So for mechanics, for example, it's those really common definitions of like, what does light and inextensible mean for a string? They always ask questions on those. There's like a table of different things they can ask questions about, so just learn that. I'll try and have an image of it up here if I can find it. That's for the mechanics one only. The stats has their own thing as well. So for example, when you have sampling methods and stuff, like benefits and like drawbacks of either one, so make sure you know that really basic stuff, and you can easily collect a few marks from that. So that's my general advice. Learn definitions. Now let's get some statistics specific advice. So with statistics, I feel like it's more on the content side than the math side. There's a lot of stuff you just need to know how to do, and you realize that more and more when you get towards the end of the course. In terms of year 12, I haven't done year 13 yet, so I'm not sure about year 13, but in terms of year 12, at the start it's very much similar to GCSE, like median calculations and all that stuff, but you're just adding a few more steps with a lot of things such as like linear interpolation, all that stuff. It's very mathsy, but then as you get towards the end, it's much more like you have to follow certain things and you have to just remember the methods of different things. So when you're doing binomial distributions and stuff, you just need to know how to do them, and once you've known how to do them, then all the questions are the same thing and you can always get the questions right. So for statistics, my advice is to just constantly be doing a variety of those type of questions. So for me, I'd do them from the mixed exercise section. I'd constantly be doing those questions again and again. It might seem weird to do the same questions over and over again, but it's purely so I remember how to do them, because you just need to learn how to do those questions and then you're fine. And I'd go over my example questions as well. I feel like statistics specifically, example questions is super important, and like that's what I would recommend personally. It's more important to learn how to do the questions for this than actually doing the questions, but obviously make sure you attempt as many of those questions as well. And don't do this only once, make sure you do this multiple times, especially right before your exam. Constantly go over how to do this stuff because it's so easily forgettable. There's always so many lines that you could forget, and you need to make sure you do everything step by step, otherwise you might get something wrong. So always go over this stuff and always go over these methods and just make sure you don't forget them. And if you do that, then the questions will be pretty easy and shouldn't be stuff that you should really worry about anymore. And if you are scared about the questions and what they can ask, all you need to do is practice. I've mentioned a few resources, I'll mention a few more. So for example, you can use MME, that's got a lot of resources as well, lots of practice questions, a lot of notes and stuff like that as well. You can also use Dr. Frost Maths, which not only has questions and stuff, but it's also got slides for free that you can access, and those are really useful, especially if you don't understand how to do questions. It's also got a lot of example questions and stuff as well for you to use. So that's my first tip for statistics. I've got a few more as well, so let me just get into those. Okay, so if you know anything about A-level maths, you should have seen this calculator before. This is such a classic calculator. So many people have this calculator. It's either this one or that like really chunky massive graph calculator, right? Now calculators are really important in A-level maths. You're gonna, if you haven't come to A-level maths yet, you're gonna realize that they have a much bigger role in A-levels than they do in GCSEs. Firstly, you don't have non-calculator papers, so everything is on the calculator now, and there's a lot of new functions that you need to get used to, and there's a lot of different ways of doing the same question, especially in statistics. This was something that really confused me at first, how you could do so many different methods for the same question, but like it makes sense. The only thing I have with that is you need to know how to do all the different ways. The main one is always just doing it on the calculator, right? But some questions require you to do it manually, especially for like integration and things. You need to be able to show the specific steps. But overall, make sure you're really familiar with your calculator and know that you can do a lot of things on here rather than spend ages doing like a standard deviation or something, because they take ages. You can literally type the numbers into your calculator and it does the exact same thing. But you can just remember the method and pretend like you did it through that method, and it will literally not make a difference. And the last tip I have for stats is to just not focus too much on the large data set. This is a really specific piece of advice, but the large data set is such a weird thing that they've introduced to A-level maths, and it just doesn't really feel like it belongs. It feels like it should have a bigger role, but it doesn't. But it's such a huge thing, and a lot of people are always confused about, like including me, I don't know what you're actually meant to memorize from it and what you're not meant to memorize from it. So you should just not worry about it, because at most you're going to lose like 1 or 2 marks overall, which isn't going to make much of a difference compared to how much you might need to memorize, right? Over time, see the type of questions they'll ask you. So some of the common ones are asking about trace values. So there will be like TR values across the spreadsheet, and you need to be able to show what that means and how those get removed when the data gets cleaned and stuff like that. But this stuff you're going to automatically, the more practice you do, the better you'll get at answering these type of questions. You should also be very familiar with the types of units that are used for different things. So wind speed uses knots, for example. So they can sometimes ask questions on that as well. And you need to also know like the months that which each of the studies took place in. The thing is, I have just decided not to learn any of them because I couldn't care less. It's such a waste of time, and I honestly think you shouldn't either. If you want to, go ahead, but like I've seen questions on it. Like I had an exam where one of the questions I had to know the months that the data was taken place in to be able to answer that question. I just got it wrong. I lost a mark, and that was it. Like it doesn't really affect anything. It's so much more worth it to go over those other type of questions than to focus on the large data set. Like honestly, it's such a useless thing. So main takeaways for stats are to learn the content of the questions as much as you can and know how to do the different steps and go over them regularly so you don't forget them, and to utilize your calculator fully, and obviously forget the large data set. No one cares about it, apart from those 1 markers that occasionally appear. These can, like, some of them are really weird, but let's just pretend they don't exist. Okay, so that's stats. Now it's mechanics. So mechanics is literally just physics mainly. It's like stuff to do with like forces and all that stuff, all the waffle rubbish, whatever. Honestly, I don't mind mechanics that much because it's more mathsy and I like mathsy stuff. The thing about mathsy stuff is that it's more problem solving based. So you're going to have questions where you might not know where to start. And so for mechanics, rather than being very familiar with how to do every question, you need to be more familiar with a variety of different ways they can ask a question. That probably made no sense, so let me just elaborate on what I mean. So for statistics, everything is very much formulaic. Everything has the same method, and just learning the method is all you need to do. Then all the questions are fine. But for mechanics, the questions are all very different, but they require some sort of maths that you need to be able to apply in all sorts of different circumstances. So it's a bit like pure maths where you might know trigonometry, but the triangle might be hidden in some like circle or something, and so it becomes so much more difficult. In this case, you're going to have like unfamiliar scenarios to do with objects and like how they interact and things. So my best advice for mechanics is to find as many questions as you can and try and understand how to do those questions, then skip them. If you know how to do them, then skip them, but if you don't know how to do them, then attempt them. And always when you're skipping a question, this is also important to check the mark scheme and see if what you thought to do was actually the way of doing it. Don't just skip a question and just pretend like it doesn't exist. Make sure you go to the mark scheme and just double check that what they did was what you were going to do as well. Also, I have one more thing I can say about mechanics, and that's to really just draw as much as you can. There's a lot of questions where they just don't draw anything out, and if you're trying to visualize all that stuff in your head, you can mess something up, and it's much easier to draw it out. And especially if you don't know where to start, if you draw the stuff out and you show the forces and everything, then you might be able to start with something, and at least you can show the examiner that you got a few of the marks. So always write out everything you know and then start working with, okay, so how am I going to progress in this question? Because you can always get yourself some free marks like that. Or for example, just writing down the equations and trying to plug in values into it. So for like SUVAT, for example, if you even do that, you could potentially get somewhere. So the most important thing is to do a variety of different questions, so you get used to all sorts of different ways they can ask questions from you, and also to draw as much as you can. So that's what I would say is most important for mechanics. Obviously, it's also important to learn those definitions, which I mentioned earlier as well. And yeah, that's really it for applied maths. Let's get to some general advice before we end this video. Okay, so I asked my friends for some advice on A-level maths in general and stuff, and I think I've got a few things here. So for example, one thing is to watch videos with questions. That can be very useful. I mentioned it earlier as well. If you're stuck on a question, you don't know how to do it, there's usually people online who've done the same question and gone through it as a worked example. So it's important to try and search online to see if anyone else has done that question, or you can usually find very similar questions and see how they do it like that. When you actually see someone doing that question, it can really help in understanding what to do as well. I've got a few more here as well. So for example, keeping track of previous assessments is really important as well. This is something that I really recommend. Whenever you do a test, make sure you keep track of it. So I scan it every single time when I have it on my iPad, and just make sure that whenever you do a test, to actually analyze what went wrong and to see what the mistakes were. So was it just silly mistakes, or did you forget how to do a topic, or did you run out of time? It's really important to see common patterns across your exams to really make sure that you stop making those same mistakes in the real exams themselves. So I think that's really important. Make sure you keep track of all your past exams and just see if there's any common patterns between them. And another thing I recommend for you to keep track of is your topics, and just overall how strong you think you are at all of them. So I just had like a Google Sheets where I would just have the list of all my topics, and once I've covered the topic, I would have like a 1 to 5 rating on how confident I felt with that topic. And overall, I'd have like this list of different topics and like my overall strengths with them, and I could just see from that which topics instantly needed help. Yeah, that is it for this video. So I hope you guys found this video useful. If you want any of the resources mentioned, they're all in the description down below, so check them out. And if you're in year 12 or year 13 and you have some more advice that you'd like to share, leave them down below in the comments as well. I really want to hear what you guys think of A-level maths as well. And yeah, apart from that, I just want to say best of luck for any exams that you may have, and I'll see you guys very soon.